Welcome to this video, which is in English, as you can hear. And you probably can also hear that I'm German and have a German accent, so please look beyond that if you may. And to my German audience members, the next videos will be in German again, don't worry. But TiHKAL is an English book, so I thought let's just talk English all the way then. Most of you probably know the Shulgins and know why they are so legendary. And if you don't, this is a good video to watch, and I hope after watching it you will know why they are so great. I recently finished TiHKAL, Tryptamines I've Known and Loved, which is the second book after PiHKAL, Phenethylamines I've Known and Loved. And I took a lot of notes, and I really wanted to show you why I love this book so much, even though it's a bit weird to make a video about TiHKAL without having a video about PiHKAL first, but that's the order in which I've read the books. I'm reading PiHKAL right now, and I'm sure there will be another video of this kind with best of PiHKAL, but this video is about the tryptamine book first. The book came out in 1997, 6 years after PiHKAL, and you have to know that Sasha uses a code name Shura and Ann uses the code name Alice. The first part of the book is autobiographical and also about a lot of other things, and the second part of the book is about the chemistry, about synthesizing and trying out new tryptamine psychedelics. I will share quotes of both parts of the book. The first passage I want to read is during a DEA inspection. They came to the Shulgin's house after the publication of PiHKAL because they were not pleased with that. And Sasha Shulgin had an analytical license from the DEA, so he was allowed to analyze controlled substances. But they really wanted to revoke that license because the DEA doesn't like it when you create new psychedelics. Who knew? And this is an excerpt about peyote and the reaction of DEA agents to peyote cacti. This is page 30. Shura's facade of pleasantness cracked only once, when, toward the end of the visit, the big uncle policeman who had asked me, hours before, whether I had a gun, poked his head around the sliding glass door and asked, "Do you have any peyote cactus here, ma'am?" I answered, "Yes, of course, right behind you, against the wall." There were several people on the patio, and every one of them froze, as if I had pointed out a boa constrictor in a corner. Then Uncle chuckled. I thought so, I just had a feeling. Suddenly there was a lot of activity around our little cactus friends. Somebody asked Shura why he had peyote cactus growing in pots, and Shura, seated at the dining table, talked through the open glass doors to the man outside, telling them about the completely unknown and unnamed trace alkaloids which no one had yet analyzed. He spoke enthusiastically, comfortable in the knowledge that his license covered his possession of the cacti. A short, heavy Asian man in his 40s, with a large, tight face, pushed his way forward and leaned against the edge of the sliding door. He looked at Shura and spoke very clearly, emphasizing every word. "Dr. Borodin, we are going to have to take your peyote cactuses away. They are going to have to be destroyed. Do you understand?" Shura rose, his face showing disbelief. "But I have a legal right to possess them, sir," he said. "My DA license covers them. Please check the regulations and you'll find that I'm right." Someone else spoke up. "Go get Fosca." While Fosca was being summoned, the group of agents moved this way and that, looking down at the cacti, stooping down to examine them more closely, pointing out various interesting details to their companions. I leaned forward in my captain's chair, watching them. Well, so these DEA agents don't recognize peyote when it's right under their noses. Weird. When I pointed them out, they acted as if the poor little things might fly up and bite them. They're actually frightened of them. Or is it that they're scared of what they think some of their cactus can do inside their heads or their souls? That's more like it. They've heard words like crazy and psychotic, and they imagine all sorts of terrible amorphous horrors, because everyone's told them that's what you get when you eat a piece of one of these little soft green things. Agent Fosca came on the scene, and the stocky Asian man with the angry face took his arm and pointed at the cacti. Then he pulled Fosca off to the side of the patio and spoke urgently into his ear. Shura waited by the glass doors, eyes riveted on the two men. After a moment, Fosca walked over to where Shura stood and said, almost apologetically, "I'm afraid the cacti will have to go, Dr. Borodin. But I've been keeping them for years to do analytical work on them. Where in the regulations does it say I can't keep a peyote to do analysis for the alkaloids?" "Show me," replied Fosca, "where there's a cut or where you've taken a slice. There isn't any sign of work being done on any of them, is there?" "Not yet," said Shura desperately. "I haven't had time yet, but that's what they're here for." He was interrupted by the Asian gentleman who brought his face within a foot of Shura's and spat out, "We're taking the cactuses, doctor, and if you keep on arguing about it, I'm going to have to read you your rights and put on the handcuffs. Am I making myself clear?" He squinted at Shura long enough to see that he had made his point, then turned and gestured to the other man. They stooped and got to work. I really like that story because it really shows the irrational fear government people or policemen or DEA men have towards innocent plants and substances. There were also a lot of cases in which policemen claimed that just being in a room with some fentanyl they seized caused them to have symptoms of an opioid overdose. Fent doesn't affect you if you don't ingest it though, and just breathing in a room that has a bag of fentanyl in it doesn't put you at risk for an overdose. So there's just so much fear and fear of losing control, I guess, that they imagine having an overdose from it. It's a nocebo effect. And I'm sure something similar happened with LSD when cops touched blotter paper or something and then felt like they were tripping. It really shows, they don't know anything about psychoactive substances and yet feel qualified enough to arrest people for them. The next passage I want to read is on page 204 and it's written by Sasha Shulgin. There was a conference held in San Francisco in approximately mid-December 1991 dedicated to the topic of LSD. It was hosted by the Drug Enforcement Administration, and invitations were extended not only to some of its staff, but to a number of officials of several police organizations around the world. There were invitees from the Netherlands, Great Britain and Australia, amongst other countries. The head count was around 200, and it was a 2-day event. The nominal host was Mr. Robert C. Bonner, who was at that time the acting head of the DEA. And since many law enforcement administrators believed that the majority of the world's production of LSD actually took place in the San Francisco Bay Area, what better place could there be than San Francisco for a conference to discuss LSD problems? Sometime before the conference was to occur, I received word that I would probably be extended an invitation to present some of the history and background material as to the origin and early uses of the drug. An actual invitation arrived about a month ahead of the meeting from somebody in Washington I did not personally know. However, my book PiHKAL had just appeared and I foresaw possible problems. Not for myself necessarily, but for my acquaintance in the DEA who had suggested my name for the invitees list in the first place. I got back in touch with him and mentioned that there might be a few people in the law enforcement world who would view PiHKAL not as the wealth of factual information that it was, thus being of value to them, but as work promoting the use of psychedelic drugs, thus being an offense to them. In the latter case, there might be some questions asked, like, who invited him here? And this might put a bit of egg on my inviter's face. I sent him a copy of the book, making clear that, as far as I was concerned, there had been no actual official invitation yet extended. Apparently some discreet inquiries were made, and I received a call from my original contact saying, gently and diplomatically, that I had been disinvited. The original invitation had apparently never been sent to me. Was it PiHKAL? I asked. Not really. No one seemed to care or even know about that. Why the no-show at San Francisco then? I asked, in as casual and unpushy a way as possible. Most divisions felt fine about it. In fact, there was a general feeling that you could make a good contribution to the meeting. But one division was somewhat uncomfortable. Uncomfortable? Well, he continued, They were afraid that you might engage Bonner in a public debate that could prove embarrassing. Indeed, I tried to visualize myself, a gray-haired old codger of an academic stripe, walking up to one of the most powerful law enforcement men in the country, second only to the head of the FBI or the Attorney General, and initiating a verbal battle that would be embarrassing. To whom, I asked myself. Somewhere I thought somebody has a very misguided opinion of someone. Was it the chief honcho who might be embarrassed by a debate with me? That doesn't speak well of their view of him. Were they afraid that I would be embarrassed? Why should anyone care how I felt? I could even see that there might be joy in certain quarters if I were to be tripped up and stumbled into some public idiocy. Were they concerned that the administration would be embarrassed? What was so fragile about their structure if one person could bring about such an imagined disgrace? And certainly it revealed the strange light in which some people view me, that they thought I would even consider such a stupid confrontation. I did not participate, of course, but I did hear quite a bit, both officially and unofficially, about what went on. It turned out that the angels had smiled upon me by keeping me home. It would have been more than just embarrassment. Had I been there, I would either have spoken up and undoubtedly been most disruptive, or I would have kept quiet and be completely ashamed of myself. It seems that a holy war, a jihad, was declared that day on LSD. It was portrayed as a thing of absolute evil, which had to be eliminated at any cost. The Catholic Church had defined the witch as an enemy, and death on the wheel was too kind of fate. The Muslim tribunal had decided that the heathen Christian devil was the embodiment of evil and was to be disemboweled. The law enforcement powers that day had declared LSD to be an agent with unbelievably destructive potential which had to be eradicated. I can't relate the actual texts that were delivered, but let me try to give the flavor of this rampage. Much of the vitriol was directed at the people associated with the drug. There are the criminals who make it. According to the authorities, they are concentrated here in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is truly the head of this monster whose tendrils extended around the world. There are the sociopathic therapists who sneak out into the woods every week to access their hidden supplies of the ergotamine tartrate precursor. There they cook up what they need for distribution amongst other therapists, for the use for their patients, and for supplying others such as school kids. These misguided therapists continue to espouse the myth that LSD has some value in medical practice. This is, of course, a rationalization of their own shameful addiction to the drug. But some of the anger was directed to the drug itself. One of the most outrageous properties given it was the capability of hiding away for years and years inside the human body, only to reappear after much time had passed and produce a flashback. The mechanisms that were offered to explain this event was so bizarre as to be humorous, had they only been offered in the spirit of comedy. Unfortunately, they were presented and accepted in total seriousness. It was stated to the attendees that even a single exposure to LSD can squirrel away a few lingering molecules in the frontal lobe of the brain where they might well stay hidden for as long as 20 years. Then they can suddenly reappear, provoking what had been called clinically an LSD flashback, which can cause the victim to become psychotic. Obvious examples were evident right here in San Francisco, said these flashback advocates. In the late 1960s, there was the summer of love with the prodigious use of psychedelic drugs, especially LSD. And look at the streets of the city today. The homeless, the psychotic, the disenfranchised. The implied explanation was that they had taken LSD and finally the tucked away molecules had descended from the frontal lobes, bringing about this modern day tragedy. The truth is that once LSD is put into the body, it produces its effects, then it and its metabolites are washed out quickly. The half-life in the blood is less than 3 hours, which says that however much might be there initially, there will be only half that amount 3 hours later. Even if the metabolic machinery of the body ignored it, the dose would be over 99% excreted in a day. With a monster dose going on Monday, there would be only 1% of it there on Tuesday, and there is no analytical tool known that could detect it on Wednesday. If any molecule of a drug, or if even a trillion molecules of a drug, can precipitate a psychotic state, then that drug is of unprecedented potency. This is simply fantasy. It has never been observed. It exists only in the dedicated minds of law enforcement and in the publication of those who make their living on the drug scare. John Lawn, the head of the DEA under the Reagan administration, gave an address at the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco in February 1986. In the question and answer session that followed, he received a written query from the floor. "What's wrong with legalizing marijuana?" he was asked. He replied without hesitation, "I think that if we decide upon legalization, we can forget democracy as we now know it. In experimental animals, mutations in the brain caused by marijuana are found not only in the user or the user's offspring, but in the offspring's offspring. The dangers associated with cannabis are different than those associated with alcohol. Marijuana is fat-soluble, and 1/3 of the brain is fat." According to this theory, the flashback, or here more likely a mutation, is seen not just 20 years later, but 2 generations later. Molecules are magically being shipped from father to son to grandson by some DNA process rather than by simple frontal lobe storage. This chapter 2 shows the ignorance of the people fighting the drug war, and it really made me laugh reading it. I want to go back a few pages to page 189 since I forgot this short quote about euphoria written by Ann. Euphoria. The first thing that can be said about this experience is it's good and nourishing food for our souls. Euphoria belongs in all our lives, as often as possible, because it feeds us with energy and hope. A dictionary will give you the following definition of euphoria, and when you've read it, think about the implications. From the Random House Webster's College Dictionary 1991, I get this simple one: a strong feeling of happiness, confidence, or well-being. And as Shura has said many times, the prefix "eu" means normal or correct. The word euphoroid means a normal functioning thyroid. The opposite of eu is dys, which means something not functioning normally. For instance, dysphoria means abnormal, as opposed to euphoria, which means feeling well, normal, and good. Thus, hyperphoria could be bliss, and hypophoria could be depression. So, how have we come to be a society in which euphoria means feeling too good, happier than you ought to, more confident than you deserve to, instead of what it ought to mean? Why is euphoria listed in the physician's desk reference as a possible negative side effect of various drugs? I wonder if we are, as a society, becoming so used to being in a state of mild depression most of the time that feeling well, happy, and full of energy engenders in some people a certain amount of suspicion and even disapproval. Perhaps some of this comes from the early Puritan and present fundamentalist Christian teachings that man is a sinner and true happiness and bliss can be expected only in heaven, if you've earned your place there by living a life full of self-sacrifice and a lot of suffering. I've experienced euphoria in its higher spiritual form, bliss, as an upwelling of thanksgiving to the source, by whatever name it is called. The feeling I have when giving wholehearted thank you to the universe is identical to that felt in a state of euphoria. Some evangelical Christians in their worship services seem to experience the two states as one. Perhaps they are. As with all emotions felt by human beings, euphoria does not last, cannot be present all the time, and is not meant to be constant. Unless you've worked your way through to becoming an initiate, a spiritual master, in which case it may be possible to live in a state comparable to euphoria, for the most part you will have ups and downs, sun and shadows, pain and exhilaration. All we can hope for, both for ourselves and those we love, is that all of us will have more moments of euphoria than sorrow, and that we will be able to renew our hope and excitement about life as often as possible. This was very interesting to me because I never thought about the word euphoria that way, and that maybe sometimes what we describe as euphoria would more logically be called hyperphoria, and euphoria is just a normal good state. I really, really like that. The next quote is also by Ann on page 218, where she talks about her work as a therapist using hypnotherapy, but sometimes also MDMA and 2C-B as a psychological tool to open up their patients. Early in our work, I had told her about my experience of my own dark side, what I called the maggot at the bottom of the well. And the resolution, or the beginning of it anyway, when I had visualized myself opening a door in my stomach and tucking inside it for warmth and nurturing the pathetic, cringing, self-hating, dirty little maggot become baby, which was my unconscious self-image. Becoming mother to my rejected child self. I also gave her the image of the volcano, a mountain full of red-hot lava, which she could find just above her navel, where anger, old and new, could be located, and from whose top the lava of fury and outrage could be dribbled safely at a rate of her own choosing. When you practice letting the lava begin to flow just a bit, I said, and find out you can stop it whenever you want to, your unconscious begins to let go of the fear of having the whole world blow up, of getting lost in the firestorm if any of that outrage is let loose. This illustrates the method Anne and her partner used in psychology. It was based on C.G. Jung's theory of the shadow, which are the things you have learned to suppress about yourself, which your parents and your society around you has taught you are evil or shouldn't be expressed in order to be a part of society, a functioning part, which is necessary because we as humans obviously have some feelings and some wishes that are bad, that just aren't really helpful in conforming to society and building a society. But this shadow can cause a lot of psychological problems, at least according to this theory, because there's a lot of shame attached to it and fear attached to it. And many people secretly believe or secretly fear that the shadow is their true self. And Anne used MDMA, but also hypnosis to let people confront their shadow and to step into their shadow or the visualization of their shadow and look out of its eyes to feel it as a companion and not as a thing to be feared, but as a necessary dark side, which can be an ally. The next quote is by Sasha again on page 279, and it's about biosynthesis and the difference between natural and synthetic compounds, which is a very important topic. A lot of people don't really understand. I mean, how often do you hear natural as being thrown out there as good and synthetic or chemical as being negative, bad, and unhealthy, even though this distinction is quite problematic, as Sasha articulates here in a very intelligent manner, as usual. The conversion of a chemical A into another chemical B is the art of synthesis, and the person who achieves the conversion is called the chemist. The usual process followed is the chemist gets A, then finds a beaker, a stirrer, a flask, a steam bath, and a reflux condenser, and boils A with this and that for some number of hours, then filters, extracts, concentrates, distills, and crystallizes. I've succeeded, the chemist will say, in synthesizing B from A in the laboratory, in a 67% yield using standard in vitro techniques. That is synthetic chemistry, at least to almost all of the chemists that you meet and talk to at the semi-annual American Chemical Society conference. The only living thing involved in the entire process is the chemist himself, who stands at the lab bench, weighs this and pipettes that, and takes his isolated product down the hall to the pharmacologist or to the patent attorney. The end product, B, the target achieved, has no other association with a living process in that it was conceived on a cocktail napkin and its uterus was a glass beaker. But A just might have been converted to B by the chemist in a quite different way. What if he had dissolved A in a cup of water or packed it into a gelatin capsule and swallowed it? His body is the beaker and his liver or lungs provide the synthetic capability for the wanted conversion. Then he collects his urine for the next 48 hours and extracts, concentrates, distills and crystallizes. He has synthesized B from A in a 67% yield using standard in vivo techniques. There were almost no glass vitro containers used, but rather the living body, vivo, was the beaker. All the biochemists and pharmacologists at the semi-annual Pharmacology and Experimental Therapeutics Conference in Boston will discuss metabolism, bioconversion, and the role of this isozyme and that enzyme promoter. It is still the art of synthesis, but it calls totally upon the living organism. There are many in-between levels of chemical reactions where one might ask if a living process was indeed being used. This entire chapter is about living systems: fungi, coral, seaweed, grasses, flowers, trees, frogs. You can learn from nature. You can study a tree to discover its patterns of growth and maturation and become intimate with it through much patience. This is most certainly in vivo synthesis. You get to know the living entity and choose to join in its world. But what if one were to use a living individual or some preparation that had once been a living system, but run the reaction in a non-living glass container? How about the making of wine by growing yeast in a sugar solution? Or the incubation of your starting material A with an otherwise discarded umbilical cord from a newborn sheep? What if you isolate the enzyme fraction from the liver of a living rabbit and use it as your chemical reagent? Are these in vivo or in vitro processes? I want to close this chapter with 3 examples of twilight chemistry that are in essence natural living systems. They are located somewhere in between the natural world, in the living organism, and the inanimate laboratory world, in the flask on the steam bath. Eloquent examples of this are the delightful reports of indole syntheses that were explored in Germany over the last 3 years. Visualize a vigorous growing mycelium culture that is synthesizing psilocin by bringing together the natural DMT in its diet with a vital but not too discriminating enzyme that has the capacity for putting a hydroxyl group onto a tryptamine. The mycelium has the knowledge of how to 4-hydroxylate something, but it doesn't really care what the something is. The available target for this skill in the natural mushroom just happens to be DMT. The product is 4-hydroxy-DMT, or psilocin, and this is what the organism makes, because this is all that can be made. There's one starting material, there's one synthetic capability, and there's one product. And this product is what gives importance and substance to the biologically active magic mushrooms, be they grown in their field or in the lab. Now let's manipulate things a little bit. Let's keep this little fungal factory going, but wash out the DMT and replace it with something like DET. The hydroxylating compulsion appears to be still there and is quite intact. What happens? The mycelium produces a bunch of 4-hydroxy-DET, an interesting compound and an active psychedelic which was first reported by the Sandoz laboratories, but a compound that is unknown in nature. I will wager that if the mycelia were to be sprinkled with MIPT, the enzyme system would produce 4-HO-MIPT, which is fully as potent as psilocin and unrecognized in any legal system in any country that I am aware of. You are exploiting a natural process by providing it with an unnatural starting material and allowing it to generate a product that is intrinsically unnatural. The mushrooms that are produced do not know that they are the vehicles of alien seed. I often heard about this experiment and I think it's absolutely fascinating because of course plants and fungi and animal bodies and so on are very capable chemists. The whole thing is to synthesize new compounds from starting materials. Our brain, our body does that every single day. And of course, you can manipulate the system, as in this case, by replacing the natural occurring DMT with another tryptamine and just letting the mushroom do its thing. And then you get like a half natural, half synthetic compound. And of course, this happens in the natural world too. All the pollutants that we as humans put into our environment are interacting with all the natural organisms in our environment, and new compounds are being created with unnatural things we humans put there, but it's natural really. So yeah, all this synthetic natural dichotomy is pretty outdated, to say the least, and it may very well be completely obsolete in a few hundred years or whatever. The next quote, also by Sasha, on page 311, is him quoting the NIMH, the National Institute of Mental Health of the US Department of Health, regarding the legality and the use of morning glory seeds, which contain LSA. One of my most cherished quotes comes from a paper published in 1966 sponsored by the NIMH, which informed the scientific community that, quote, Law enforcement offices and garden seed companies in the United States have recently become concerned because of reports in the lay press that students, psychologists, and maladapted persons of bohemian habits, beatniks, were ingesting seeds of cultivated morning glories sold in garden supply shops. They spoke of suicide attempts and severe reactions with dosages of 250 seeds that required hospitalizations. There was fear that a potentially dangerous psychoactive drug abuse problem might be arising in the United States. Yeah, I wanted to include the quote because I am maladapted persons of bohemian habits. Beatniks is such a funny quote. And yeah, a label I really would be honored if someone gave me that. Like, yeah, I am a maladapted person of bohemian habits. Definitely, I like that. The next quote is by Sasha again on page 338. The chapter is called Designer Drugs, and it's about the perception of designer drugs by society, which is a very interesting topic to me because I really like to inform myself about so-called designer drugs, and the stigma around those new psychotropic substances is very, very great, even greater than with the more well-known substances. There are two concepts used presently in our country that should be held separate. On the one hand, there is the designing of drugs, which describes an exciting and socially acceptable research process. Through drug design, one can conceive of, synthesize, and define new drugs that are related to old drugs. On the other hand, there is the term designer drugs. A clothing company called Levi's had a popular product, a line of blue, washable pants that were known as blue jeans. A fad started up for well-known people to add a little bit of personal identification to otherwise normal jeans and attach their names to the product, and sometimes to sell them for twice the usual price. One could find Gloria Vanderbilt jeans and Calvin Klein jeans. These became known as designer jeans, which was a term of merchandising and promotion. When a series of unrecognized variations of the narcotic fentanyl appeared on the street as substitutes for heroin, the term designer drugs was coined by Professor Gary Henderson at the University of California at Davis to refer to these substitutes. However, there were no well-known people associated with the new drugs. The only names associated with them were street slang terms such as China White. The term designer drugs became a term of condemnation and was used to imply an attempt to circumvent the law. It says, I will get around your careful definition of explicitly defined illegal drugs, and I will provide new drugs that fall outside of that definition. What are the motives for designing new chemicals? There are three that are obvious to me: the circumvention of drug law, the circumvention of patent claims, and the development of research tools. And each of the motives presents the researcher, the scientist, the inventor in a distinct and well-defined role. The effort to evade the explicit letter of the law is the act that gave rise to the actual term designer drugs, and it is used in the United States only in its most negative sense. The average citizen, on hearing the phrase, will immediately assume the target to be bad. The chemist involved is believed to be trying to develop something that would bypass the existing narcotic laws. He will be assumed to be engaged in some unacceptable behavior, and the authorities will try to stop him and then punish him. The drugs themselves will be branded as being evil, having been made only for the purpose of appealing to the drug user, to the antisocial dropout, to those who define the worst of our society. The second reason for the designing of new chemicals is quite the opposite. It celebrates all of the acceptable attributes of our Western capitalist philosophy. The rationale for the designing of new drugs goes something like this. Our competition is making piles of money with its sales of one of the most in-demand products of the year. For a pharmaceutical company, this might be a popular antidepressant. For an agricultural industrial corporation, this might be a potent and highly selective insecticide. For a tobacco company, this might be an additive that makes smoking more pleasant or less painful. Each of these products will certainly be protected by an airtight patent. How does a competing company break into a highly successful monopoly? It tells its research chemists to go into the laboratory and design a new molecule that will get around the letter of the patent law. Go and invent something to make and sell that would not be specifically illegal. The chemist involved will try to develop something that would not be in conflict with the existing patent laws. Society responds to this example of circumvention of the law in a totally positive way. This behavior is always applauded as being completely correct. The intellectual environment that surrounds the search for these drugs, these new industrial discoveries, is held in the highest esteem. This type of drug design is considered to be totally appropriate. The chemist involved in this kind of search is seen as being engaged in the most noble of scientific work, and his employers will reward his successes. And as to the drugs themselves could well be accepted as being of great social value, and that they could contribute to a better standard of living. But remember that, although the reasons that justify these two very different philosophies for the designing of drugs are completely opposite, the goals were the same. The motive is to get around the law and to make money in the process. They are different only as to their acceptance by our society. The procedures actually employed in each are identical. In each of the two cases, the inventor explores a path of discovery that follows closely to what is known, and he learns from it, and perhaps even steals from it, but he always takes care not to make anything so similar to it that the law, be it narcotics law or patent law, will pay too much attention to what he is doing. The third technique for the designing of new drugs contains elements of both of these early examples. The modification of known things to make unknown things, and yet it has a purpose all its own. This is the design of instruments of research, the design of instruments of inquiry. Here one can create chemicals for the use of researchers, tools that might answer questions about uniquely human capabilities such as logical thought, self-esteem or lack of it, motivation or lack of it, joy, euphoria, despair, schizophrenia. How can one design a probe that will reveal some details of the human mind? One must always remember that here one is not speaking about the brain. The brain has been looked at in great anatomical detail over the years. It has been the target of a great deal of recent day studies in biochemistry, neurotransmitter receptors, actions of agonists and antagonists. But the brain that is most often used is the brain of the rat, as that is the only presently acceptable workplace for the neurochemists. But I am speaking here about the mind. This is found only in humans. How does one design the tools for exploring the normal function of the human mind? Or for exploring the possibilities of repairing problems with mental functions, not brain functions, so as to bring them back to the normal? Or for exploring or even extending and elaborating upon these mental functions, to extend them beyond what we presently accept as the normal? This quote very much explains Shulgin's philosophy and his reason for doing what he did. He wanted to explore the mind with the tools, with the psychedelic drugs he made, and not just focusing on the biological activity, to what receptor does this drug go, what is the action that it has on the receptor, and how is it excreted in the body and so on, but really to see the mind as opposed to the physical brain as a function which should be explored in detail. Because, well, it's the most important thing in our lives. We humans, of course, stand out because we have the capability of thinking very complex thoughts and thinking about ourselves and reflecting on the world. And psychedelic drugs are obviously a very, very good tool, or drugs in general, a very good tool of understanding what goes on in our minds. And they can be therapeutic tools too, as we now see with the new studies that are coming out and this kind of psychedelic renaissance. I'm of the firm belief that some psychedelic drugs and some empathogenic drugs and some dissociatives too can be very, very good tools for psychotherapy. A quote by Ann on page 164 about the use of psychedelics for fun or for spiritual growth really spoke to me. I quote, "As to the claim that the psychedelics are escapist drugs, I can say this. There are, indeed, moments of intense beauty and wonder, as well as the occasional burst of laughter to be had during a psychedelic experience. But I have never gone through one that didn't involve some work. I don't mean to imply that escaping is in itself wrong or destructive, if done occasionally and in balance with other aspects of one's life. After all, listening to music can be called escape, So can watching television, making love, reading a book, or taking a walk under the stars. All these can be thought of as escapes, especially if your view of life and what you call reality is generally grim and sour. The young college-age psychedelic user who take drugs at rave dances might be said to be using them for escape, rather than for psychological or spiritual work. This is certainly not the highest and best use of these drugs in the opinion of some. I'm not so sure. For many of the dancers at a rave, the combination of trance-inducing music and a usually low dose of MDMA, for instance, or LSD, creates an emotional openness and a sense of psychic participation with their fellow dancers. They sometimes experience a degree of euphoria which is absolutely unknown in their everyday lives. There is some question as to whether this state is induced as much by the trance dancing as by any drugs they might have taken. But whether it is or not, I believe that euphoria is good for you, especially when it is achieved at no cost or pain to anyone else. Most of the dancers at rave parties have spent a good part of their lives living in big cities, and they are not used to trusting or feeling affection towards strangers. In fact, life in most of the world's big cities, as a rule, demands continual caution and suspicion when one is outside the home. For some of these young adults, the only time they can let anxiety and fear of the stranger drop away is at a rave. There they can experience trusting fellowship with many others in a dancing situation which threatens no one and can instead open their hearts and give them a feeling of pleasure, companionship and hope. As far as I'm concerned, none of this adds up to be a threat to society. Psychedelic exploration for me has always meant working, trying to come to terms with some aspect of my interior universe that makes me uncomfortable, dealing with insights into my own past or present behavior which may be disturbing, trying to dig out answers to basic questions about the nature of the world, the cosmos and whatever it is we call God. I have had well over 1,000 exposures to these particular chemical tools. Escape is precisely what they have never given me, and my return to consensual reality, so-called ordinary life, has always been a pleasure, no matter how positive the psychedelic experience. But then, I am blessed in having a good life to return to. For those whose everyday lives are not happy or fulfilling, the psychedelic experience can serve to renew their sense of meaningfulness and put them back in touch with wonder and joy. And then goes on to describe different states which she often feels while using a psychedelic, and when describing the oceanic experience, that is also known as participation mystique in the words of the great Micrea Eliade, which she describes as being a state characterized by a sense of connection emotionally and spiritually with all other living beings, including the body of the planet itself. It's a place of exquisite joy. You feel immense gratitude for being alive and able to participate in an extraordinary natural system which is suffused with wisdom and an all-encompassing love. I know this state, and she quotes a poem by Edna St. Vincent Millay, which I have not heard of before, but I really, really love this poem, and I think it describes this oceanic experience very, very well. The poem is called Renaissance, and here are 3 brief passages from different parts of the very long work. I saw and heard and knew at last the how and why of all things past, and present and forevermore. The universe, cleft to the core, lay open to my probing sense. No hurt I did not feel, no death that was not mine each last breath. That crying met an answering cry from the compassion that was I. The world stands out on either side, no wider than the heart is wide. Above the world is stretched the sky, no higher than the soul is high. The heart can push the sea and land, farther away on either hand. The soul can split the sky in two and let the face of God shine through. The next quite short quote I want to share with you is on page 352 by Sasha. It's about the Analog Act, which came into power in 1986 in the USA. It regulates and prohibits the sale and the use of psychoactive compounds which are close in action or in structure to controlled substances. We have something similar in German since 2017, I think. maybe 16, something like that. And in the Netherlands, there is a similar law being passed in a few months. And yeah, it's just a unfortunately pretty normal thing to have like whole classes of compounds being prohibited all at once, which is obviously very bad for research and bad for cognitive freedom of the individual. Sasha writes about it, I quote, "The FDA has always carefully avoided any act that could be interpreted as directing the practice of medicine. That was the province and the responsibility of the physician. And they have always avoided any intimate involvement in the structure of academic research, as this was the province and the responsibility of the individual researcher. The officials of the FDA had never before been given the role of judging the merits of research, or been put in a position of having the power to allow or disallow the pursuit of a research question. That has classically been a matter involving the relationship between the researcher, his professional peers, and his experimental subjects. The placement of medical research approval within law enforcement, the DEA, is unthinkably stupid and inappropriate and cannot be tolerated. We, as the research community, have largely accepted this complete somersault over the age-old traditions of exploratory research. We have quietly acceded to a non-scientific authority that can oversee and, to an increasing degree, influence the direction of our inquiry. Somewhere along the line in this country, within the past 5 years, we have begun to lose that sense of independent looking, asking, searching, and questioning, and the insistence upon being personally responsible for what we do in our search and how we conduct that search. I am making a heartfelt plea for the changing of these drug laws. Laws which take the research initiative concerning human studies away from scientists and give it to politicians and bureaucrats. I have 3 more quotes from the second half of the book, which is the chemistry section, in which a lot of different tryptamines are being shown, their synthesis is being described, and also some trip reports and dosage and duration information is shared. And this trip report with perhaps 15 milligrams of smoked 5-MeO DMT, and I want to read that to you. I quote, "I took a hit from the pipe with 5-methoxy in it, and after the 8 to 10 seconds it took to carry the chemical to my brain, I remember starting to fall over from my sitting position. My normal physical perceptions dissolved away from my awareness. My ears started to ring, and I started to float off. I was actually aware of a certain resonation of my aural perception, an electrical buzzing that fluctuated in sync with my visual perception. What I saw can only be described as a fantastically subtle, multicolored phosphine, completely filling every area visually available. I saw it in this way because I was simultaneously losing contact with my body. I could not tell if my eyes were open or shut, although I initially had the feeling that they were darting back and forth from side to side. These feelings and sensations build up in intensity very quickly, a matter of seconds. I can remember this feeling of building intensity up to a point, and then I was not there in my body or in time. In the 10 to 15 minutes that my body was under the influence of the drug, my mind was completely referenceless. There was no way for my consciousness to limit or gauge the stimuli my being was barraged with. I remember switching to a perception where the endless and intricate phosphine was love and the energy of light. I called upon those forces within my being to realign and submit, to let go of all the cogent fears and just exist. And that innate decision saved me a lot of psychic damage. What is most outstanding about the way it feels is an inability to judge in any way by any method of the mind. It is unconquerable, as deep and profound as a totally unconditional love that is life. What a trip, huh? And I also want to share this very short 15 milligrams smoked report. At about 60 seconds after I smoked this freebase, I beheld every thought that was going on everywhere in the universe and all possible realities while I was racked out with this horrible, ruthless love. It scared the hell out of me. When I could see again, 15 minutes later, it was almost as if there was an echo of a thought in my head saying that I was given an extremely rare look at the true consciousness of it all. I've never been hit this hard since then. A definite +4. Yeah, those two reports really show what a special substance 5-MeO-DMT is. Very different from N-DMT. It's its own thing and shouldn't be used by anyone who isn't very experienced with psychedelics. At least that's my opinion. The next paragraph is about tryptophan, a non-psychedelic tryptamine which is sometimes used as a sleep aid and was available over the counter for some time, but then got prohibited because of very stupid reasons. And yeah, Shulgin writes about this on page 582. Then an incident occurred in 1989 at the Showa Denko company in Japan, where a change in the manufacturing procedure produced an impure product. The impurity led directly to a health problem, a condition with a flu-like syndrome called eosinophilia myalgia syndrome, EMS, which caused some 1,500 incidents in the United States, including 38 deaths. The FDA quite rightly removed tryptophan from the market on the 7th of November 1989 and banned its distribution. The source of the health problem was quite quickly identified, and the production operation was changed back to the original process, and the tryptophan product was again available free of any toxic impurity. This freedom from any impurity was acknowledged by the FDA, but they transferred the toxic aspect of the substance from the impurity contained within it, now no longer present, to the substance itself. The implied declaration was that tryptophan was intrinsically toxic. The sale of tryptophan as dietary supplements for man is now illegal. Dietary supplements to animal stock feed is okay. Tryptophan is available to hospitals for use in critical situations. Tryptophan is available as a prescription drug, but it is not available in the health food stores and so cannot be explored by the lay researcher. The world of inquiring into the action on normals, schizophrenics, alcoholics, people who are overweight, people who are depressed, is denied both to the private individual and to the clinical researcher. There are commercially available drugs, all approved, that can play the same role. Within 4 days of the announced ban of tryptophan, after the problem had been resolved and corrected, a broad promotion of Prozac, an antidepressant similar in action to tryptophan, appeared in Newsweek. Prozac is still widely promoted. Tryptophan is still not available to the private individual. Both can play the role of being an effective sedative. A quotation from the FDA Dietary Supplement Task Force report, page 2, June 15, 1993, deserves careful reading. The FDA task force considered various issues in its deliberations, including what steps are necessary to ensure that the existence of dietary supplements on the market does not act as a disincentive for drug development. What are dietary supplements? How might they get in the way of pharmaceutical industry creations? Where is the line to be drawn between nature and big business? What plants are there that might serve as health adjuncts? I truly think that we are being had by the powers that be who are authorized to control our access to medicines. Today we cannot eat ABC because it contains an outlawed drug. Tomorrow we cannot eat DEF because it's suspected of containing an outlawed drug. The day after tomorrow we cannot eat GHA because it has not been shown to be free of outlawed drugs. And yet everything in the drugstore had its origin somewhere in a botanist's observation or in a chemist's mistake. Where does this oppression stop? When do we say, "Hold, enough"? We must be free to eat this plant and smell that flower as we choose to. To deny us this right is to deny us the simple and basic freedom that is our constitutional heritage. If I want to continue to eat bananas and drink milk, I will do so and get off my back. If I want to consume tryptophan because I feel it brings me closer to God and Jesus or makes me sleep better, I will consume tryptophan. You, the empowered authority, will not tell me not to. As was so eloquently expressed in Leonard Bernstein's West Side Story, when the group of heroes came up against the authorities, they said, "Hey, Officer Krupke, crap you." I like the indignation and the anger, the basic anger at stupidity that is being transmitted in those lines. And it's a rightful anger. No one should prohibit you from taking a compound if you want to. That's the basic idea, I guess. The last quote I want to share is from the ProLad entry on page 576. It's about someone consuming 175 micrograms of ProLad, a close analog of LSD, orally. This is an intellectually clear material, but it's a funny material. I'm certainly at a +3, or at least I was a couple of hours ago. How does one describe ProLad? It's not quite this and not quite that sort of stuff. Or to borrow from Winnie the Pooh, it is not at the bottom and it's not at the top, but this is the stair where I always stop. Oh, never mind. I mean, I'm not sure how to categorize this material. It's pleasant, it's fine for fooling around, it's good for humor, even excellent. It's very good for clear thinking, although not cosmic type particularly. It's a sort of nice, comfortable, middle American, Julie 4th picnic, apple pie with ice cream sort of psychedelic. The kind that you can wrap up in gold and white striped paper for your youngest aunt, the one who likes to think she's really a bit wild, you know, the kind of psychedelic that's a bit much for your dad or mom, but it's just jazzy enough to keep some younger relatives happy with you for a few months. However, I must tell you, kid, if you try to bring this to the big town, well, it's pretty much dropped off now. I'm gonna lie myself on down. I don't know how you feel, but this entry, this trip report really makes me want to try ProLad. It seems to be a very funny material. Okay, this was everything I've got. I hope you enjoyed that, and if you don't know the book, I really hope you buy it, if you can, directly from Transform Press, because Transform Press is still run by the daughter of Ann Shulgin, and it supports the Shulgin Foundation and the Shulgin Farm. So yeah, go ahead and buy TiHKAL and also PiHKAL. I'm almost finished with reading PiHKAL. I have some 40 pages left in the first half of the book and maybe 100 pages in the second half of the book. And I will definitely do a best of PiHKAL too. Yeah, the next episodes will be in German again, probably, but I hope some of the German listeners could also follow me and that my accent is not too bad. I'm very painfully aware of that. Yeah, see you or hear you next time.